Jimit Arora, Research IT and Digital Transformation Practice Leader, leads Everest Group's technology research practice, which is focused on conducting in-depth research on the full spectrum of technology transformation across IT applications, infrastructure, cloud, and next-generation technologies. Jimit is based out of Everest Group's New York office. Cecilia Edwards, Consulting IT and Digital Transformation Practice Leader at Everest Group, has over 20 years of experience in strategy and management consulting. She works with a number of Everest Group clients focusing on next-generation IT strategies, enterprise as a service models, and IT-enabled business transformation. A veteran officer of the United States Air Force, Captain Edwards also spent 7 years with Boston Consulting Group prior to joining Everest Group. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jimit. Take it away, Jimit.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming everyone to this webinar. So to get us started, I wanted to provide a quick outline of what we will cover in today's session, roughly 45 or so minutes on slide 3. We will be structuring our session into 3 parts. We start off with a framework of how we think about digital transformation and the elements that drive success in digital. Second, which is the prime focus of the webinar today, is 5 traits which we captured from our research with over 650 IT executives. And a quick point here, this is based on 5 distinct studies that we performed over a period of 12 months as part of our IT and digital transformation program. So there'll be more details on that later. And then the third category, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. With that, let's dive into the first piece where we define digital and talk about a digital success framework. As you look at the definition of digital that we have in front of you, we see digital as the use of technology to dramatically enhance the experience of users. So we're taking a very experience-first view to how we define digital. And a key point to note here is that users includes both customers, employees, as well as partners or ecosystem players that comprise any organization. And it's not just a customer-centric view as most definitions of digital tend to assume. I think the second important message we want to leave behind is that there's a pretty important distinction between how organizations think of digital projects and digital transformation. We tend to think of it as the small d, big D, or small transformation, big transformation, small t, big T, whichever one you choose. But we think there's a foundational difference in terms of how organizations plan for and deliver these 2 distinct aspects of digital. So on the left-hand side, digital projects are the ones that help organizations leverage technologies to reduce cost, increase speed or quality, while largely staying within the current operating model. And this is important, right? Creating a simple mobile app, for example, can be an example of a digital project just to streamline interaction between customers or to make information available to sales reps that might earlier be available through a web portal, right? It's important, but it tends to create incremental value within the confines of the same model. Big T transformation, which is what we call digital transformation, is one where we are fundamentally focused on helping an organization drive business objectives. And this usually, if I refer us back to the definition, takes the form of transforming customer or employee experience by fundamentally changing the business model that's used. And what we've seen is when companies embrace this definition of digital transformation, they tend to realize breakthrough or transcendental value. As we move to the next slide, I think there's another conversation we need to have, and there's a lot of discussion about IT firms are currently or IT organizations are currently at a point of inflection, right? And we see this as 3 waves that have happened over a period of time. The first era, or simply wave one, was when we thought of IT as a shared service, right? And this was all about operational excellence, how we drove the transition to ERPs. So think of the 80s, parts of the 90s, when we were embedded within IT as a shared service. I'd say over the last 20 or so years, we've been focused on IT as a cost optimized service. Labor arbitrage had a pretty significant role to play. As you'll see, the focus areas now not only included operational excellence, but kind of went on to focus on IT cost optimization. So each successive era is capturing all the attributes of the previous one. As we think about the most latest era that's being ushered in by digital transformation, we see IT as a business value creator. And this obviously means leveraging an array of new technologies, new delivery models, and we're using these new technologies and new delivery models to not only transform experiences, but also to fundamentally bend the cost curve through automation and hyperproductivity. You know, that said, one of the things that tends to happen, there's a lot of technology adoption, a lot of digital projects, a lot of digital transformation going on, but in this inflection, we're seeing a lot of missteps. And failure rates are pretty high. So our research suggests that over 75% of digital initiatives tend to fail, which is what caused us to come up with what we call is the digital success model that I'll define in a second. So as you think about the digital success model, one of the themes that we like to amplify is most organizations tend to view digital as a technology first play. And the key message we want to leave behind is that technology is just one of several components that an organization needs to put in place to make digital transformation a success. Two broad elements, the way we think about it for digital success. One is getting the strategy right, and then the second is to get the solution model right. So if you think about some of the strategic elements, do you have the right transformation vision or not? You need to think about the economic model. Who funds it? How much? Is it OPEX, CAPEX? Making those decisions becomes key because the funding mechanism tends to be different than traditional IT projects. Do you have the right organization structure and culture in place? That becomes important. And of course, the necessary performance management and governance. The second part of this is the solution model. Technology, of course, becomes a part of that. But beyond that, talent is a pretty significant enabler and needs to be managed differently to get digital transformation correct. More on that later. And then process and innovation. If you think about the traditional people process technology, the process innovation becomes a key enabler for the solution model. And finally, digital cannot happen within the confines of an organization's firewall. So ensuring the right ecosystem and sourcing partners becomes key. So all of these elements, need to be harmonized to make digital successful. So now jumping into the study. So as I said, we examined over the last 12 months. We conducted 5 individual studies across overall digital transformation effectiveness. We looked at some of the enabling functions such as next generation infrastructure, applications, cybersecurity, automation, which spanned 650 IT executives over 10 industries through a combination of small and medium enterprises. And we kind of came up with this framework, which we call is the Pinnacle Model framework, where essentially we look at the elements of the digital success model on the x-axis as the capability dimension. And then we also measure value achieved or business outcomes across cost, operations, and business impact. And the leading enterprises are the ones which informed the traits that we are going to describe right now. With that, Cecilia, let me invite you to talk through some of these traits.
Great, thanks, Shamit. So we have some lessons from the digital transformation leaders, and as the title of the webinar suggests, we're going to cover 5 traits and then give you some examples of what some of the enterprises that are having success are doing and how they're kind of living out these traits. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so we're probably going to move through these pretty quickly, but you will have access to all of these slides afterwards so that you can read through the materials. So the first trait that we're going to cover is around having a clear business-driven purpose. And when we think about that, it's tempting to really think about digital transformation as being all about technology. I think the setup that Jamit just gave you would suggest that we obviously think about it as more than that, and those organizations that are successful think about it as broader than that. It's really about transformation. It's around business transformation, and they understand that technology is just merely an enabler of achieving business success. So some examples of what that means this comes from across of our studies, and we've got one of these charts for each of the 5 traits. So I'm going to take a second to show you how to read them. If you saw on the chart that Jamit showed around the Pinnacle Model, we talked about those folks that are in the upper right-hand quadrant. They are getting high outcomes and they have high capabilities. Those folks are the ones that we call the Pinnacle enterprises. Their data is always listed in green. The rest of the market, their data is what's listed in blue. And so throughout these studies, what we did is we said, what do we think the people that are achieving high capability, high outcomes and have high capability, what are they doing differently from the rest of the market? So on this first dimension, having a clear business-driven purpose, one of the things that we see is this pretty stark contrast. All of the Pinnacle enterprises view this as business driven. Anything from competitiveness, the ability to target new segments, reducing time to market. Even when they're looking at their security initiatives, they're looking at security not just as a back end function, but how is it going to support and drive their transformation initiatives. Even their infrastructure strategies are really about developing differentiated products and services. So you see this broad mix that enterprises are looking at. When we think about the outcomes, what is a business outcome? We look at it in 3 dimensions. The typical way to think about outcomes from anything that is IT related tends to be to look at the cost. You look at what's it going to do to reducing the IT cost. Increasingly, you started looking at whether or not it was going to have an impact on business cost as well. But the greatest value and what we see digital transformation enabling is to really think about impact across a number of dimensions. Think about the operational impact, things like adding value to customers, increasing employee satisfaction, simplifying and streamlining operations, improving efficiency, all of those operational impacts. And then the strategic things. We saw a number of them on the last slide, but improving your net promoter scores, increasing assets under management, reinventing a customer experience. All of those types of things from a strategic perspective and the operational ones have an opportunity to create much greater value than just the cost impact. Interestingly enough, if you think about the business impact, most organizations tend to get higher cost reduction with this focus than they did if their primary objective were just about cost impact. Here are a few examples also of the strategic choice that enterprises need to make when they're thinking about digital transformation. You have to decide just how digital do I want to be. And so when we're addressing most of these strategies, we really aren't looking at the digital natives. We're really looking at legacy enterprises that are undergoing some form of transformation. So you might be a digital laggard, and you could decide you're going to stay there. For most organizations, it's probably not a good choice, but you could stay there. Then there are those who just say, I want to meet the table stakes. There are a lot of organizations that are still working just to get to the level of table stakes. So that's one where you adopt just enough technology to stay relevant, but you don't really rock the boat too much. Then if you want to be a leader in your industry, the example we have on this slide is John Hancock's Vitality in the insurance space, where they said, let me think through how I can take digital and push the trends a bit further. Think about adoption differently, shape my operating model differently, think about modernizing my legacy IT systems. You could move a little bit further and be a disruptive legacy digital leader. Schneider Electric is a great example of this. pretty old school type of business, but they have become not just a leader in their industry, but they're considered pretty disruptive digital leader as a legacy. So they're disrupting their industry, they're investing in innovation, they have data and analytics driving all of their operations. You got to be willing to cannibalize your business, and you got to be willing to rapidly replace your legacy systems. Most people, when they think about digital, move all the way to the right, the disruptive digital natives. These are the people that came in, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, et cetera. There are some legacy companies that make such a transformation that they end up looking like a digital native, but the digital natives really don't have legacy systems that they've had to invest in and things like that. Over time, their systems, if they haven't built their business to be continuously transforming, will become legacy, but that tends not to be where they are. So businesses need to make a decision about how digital you want to be as well. So let's move to trait number 2. Jamit, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Perfect. Yeah, and Cecilia, thanks so much for kind of providing those examples. And what's been interesting as we've examined a number of these digital transformation journeys, and what really separates successful strategies from not so successful ones is the fact that digital transformation leaders who are doing it right build enterprise-wide commitment to transformation. They recognize that digital transformation equates to business transformation, and therefore engage more than the technology teams to the discussion. If you look at some practical data around this, and I'm gonna use one of our 5 slides, one of our 5 studies, which is the automation study. And automation is an interesting one, right? Because it seems like a common technology deployment. Even for something as simple as that, successful enterprises embraced a broader, more inclusive agenda from the get-go to ensure success. Keeping the same framework in mind as Cecilia had mentioned earlier, where green is the top right, Pinnacle Enterprises, 100% of Pinnacle Enterprises recognized RPA as part of a broader enterprise transformation agenda versus thinking of it just as a technology deployment. They created cross-functional, cross-team centers of expertise, right, or centers of excellence, which were not just limited to IT or that function. And then, 100% of them measured success in terms of process efficacy versus, again, technical tool deployment measures, and created metrics that were more organization-wide. And if you just kind of, to give you another illustration of that, as we've taken this to different levels, moving just beyond automation, we call out digital transformation as a team sport. And if you were to examine, across different phases, who ends up owning the journey, in 81% of the situations, we saw that the ideation was actually being owned by the business. Design was predominantly owned by the technology architecture group, so 88% situations there, so high consistency. Delivery was happening across a variety of situations. In some cases, it was IT. In some cases, it was through a special digital transformation office. And interestingly, it's not a one and done. It's an ongoing journey. And that, again, was going back into the business. So this kind of illustrates how successful companies are truly making this an enterprise-wide initiative versus running it just within the technology silo. Cecilia, let me in an agile manner, let me pass it back to you.
Great. So let's talk agile. Agile is no longer merely about a software development approach, but it really is a cultural shift and a management philosophy that enables enterprises to endure the pace of change that's required by digital. You can't keep running at the same pace. You can't do the 3 to 5 year planning processes that people are comfortable with anymore if you expect to be successful in digital transformation. So let's look at some of the data that we picked up from here as well. So when we think about moving to an age of agile. And again, not just agile software development, but really thinking about agile management and a culture of agile. You're really moving into an era where change is the only consistent element. And so change management, we actually call it journey management, but change management becomes a major part of what companies need to do. And leaders in the successful leaders of digital transformation are actively participating in their change management programs. They have change management teams that are conducting detailed awareness programs. This is really, as Jamit said, this is an enterprise-wide activity, and they make the agile portion of it an enterprise-wide thing as well. They make sure that transitions are in place. The area that's interesting, so the last two on this slide, well, nobody's that far ahead. The Pinnacle enterprises, most of the times we're seeing them in the high 90s to 100%. They're much lower on these in terms of maintaining a high tolerance for risk and encouraging frequent and speedy implementations, but they are still way ahead of the rest of the market, where you have somewhere in the half of them have managed to figure out how to have a high tolerance for risk, and half of them have figured out how to do speedy implementation of new ideas and innovation. And those two things are core to how many businesses operate. And so it's no surprise that people are really challenged with how they think about risk and how you think about bringing in new ideas and disrupting the status quo. So those are a number of things, and we expect to see those numbers for Pinnacles increase over time as they have more comfort with how they're managing some of the risk. I mentioned journey management just a moment ago. When you move into a digital transformation, and you're moving into an age of agile, this concept that many people have that agile, because I don't have a detailed 3 to 5 year waterfall plans, that this is somehow unstructured. Actually, agile is probably way more structured and way more disciplined, a way to manage an enterprise than in a waterfall perspective, because it allows you to not have this kind of false sense of precision in your plans. It forces you to, on a regular basis, evaluate whether or not the activities that you're doing are delivering the intended outcomes, and you have to continuously shift and improve and update. So if you take a traditional PMO change management approach, you're actually not going to have much success. When we think about journey management, it is PMO plus. It's around developing the initial change vision and strategic intent, but updating that on a regular basis. It's about thinking through what the hazards are and identifying new opportunities for the business as quickly as possible and incorporating those into your plans, maintaining a sense of urgency, obviously sticking with the focus on business outcomes, securing resources, bringing all the senior stakeholders, and typically the journey management needs to have senior executives participating in it, but now I need to make sure my CEO and my board are all aware and informed and supportive of what we're doing, so that you're driving the entire enterprise through a process that's going to deliver significant business value. So back over to you, Jamit, for the next trait. Or actually, that's still me. So I'm going to talk about engaging in measured risk taking. So that's our fourth trait. And when we think about what that means, digital transformation has this inherent level of risk involved. We saw the data in the last piece where some folks are really challenged in moving into that direction. There's a higher level of risk because you're continuously transforming, but the good leaders actually embrace the risk and they adopt new management approaches to handle that risk. So they kind of recognize that it's there, but deal with it in new manners. Let's look at some data. So Pinnacle enterprises in some of our studies did have a much higher risk tolerance. They had a willingness to disrupt the status quo. That's probably the biggest issue. Many organizations think about the new as threatening, but they think that somehow the status quo is okay and don't apply the same level of analysis to the status quo that they do to the new ideas. Sticking to the status quo can be very risky in and of itself. Digital transformation leaders who are successful know that they are required to think about, evaluate, and disrupt as necessary their status quo. They use budgeting to quantifiably decrease the risk that's associated with their transformations. And interestingly, they will end a project that doesn't deliver results. That's a very, very difficult thing for many organizations, in particular from a technology perspective, because historically you plan, you budget, and then you execute per the plan, and you're rewarded when you finish the project as planned. It doesn't make a difference whether or not that's delivering the results you intended. In digital transformation, you're willing to end a project if necessary. One of the things that I mentioned was this use of funding to manage the risk. Sounds a little counterintuitive, like it might slow things down, but you've actually, if you adopt a funding approach that's similar to what venture capitalists do, where those are organizations who are used to funding things that are in early stage, not yet proven up. They don't go commit a huge 3 to 5 year budget that just gets spent and see what happens at the end of that time frame. They actually think about different milestones, and the milestones are associated with a risk that you're trying to mitigate, and you fund enough to prove up or to mitigate the first risk. So you might have something like an ideation phase. You fund just enough to prove up the idea. If it's proven up, you fund it more to develop a solution. If it doesn't pan out, then you eliminate it. So you allow more ideas to be brought into the fold, looked at and evaluated, but you then have a measured approach to the funding. So as you hit different milestones, you release more funding. In this manner, you're enabling lots and lots of innovation. You're keeping the pace of change going, but managing the risk associated with funding it. So now I'll turn this over to Jamit for the fifth trait.
Thanks, Cecilia. And you know, I spoke about talent, and I think it's one of the most underappreciated themes that we've seen. But as people have gone through their cycles of missteps, successful digital transformation leaders are recognizing that there's a need to invest in building talent ahead of the demand, right? And driving innovation in your talent practices become key to success in digital transformation. And as we look at some of the data, right, we are seeing some interesting innovations start to happen in terms of how Pinnacle enterprises are driving and how they are meeting the demands that are coming out of the new talent. So acqui-hiring is becoming a pretty significant portion of what they're doing. There's more experimentation that's happening. So things such as reskilling, leveraging outsourcing, you'll see that the green bars and the blue bars are fairly consistent. In fact, the Pinnacle enterprises are using these practices modestly lower than the broader industry. But when it comes to themes such as acqui-hiring, crowdsourcing, social hiring, they're definitely driving a lot more innovation. And if you think about why that's happening, right, there's a pretty significant skill shortage which exists in the industry right now. And you know, we've done some pretty significant analysis looking at the across categories, what's really the demand and supply gap, not just for specialized skills, but also for some pretty standard skills which are kind of called out in black. And what's quite interesting is even for old technologies such as Java, SQL, C#, you see that there's a pretty significant demand supply gap. And if you think about it, that's not surprising given that currently we have negative unemployment in the technology sector in the United States, right? and that demand supply gap is just expected to worsen. So it becomes really critical for organizations that want the talent to succeed to start investing ahead of demand. And you'll see some of the practices that organizations are taking. We spoke about talent acquisition. When it comes to talent development, there's a fair amount of innovation going on there as well. So you see themes like developing different qualification programs, right? Developing continuous learning versus, the traditional approach of milestone-based learning. There's a lot of cross-training, workforce optimization that's going on, which is driving value and innovation in the market. I wanted to kind of sum this theme up by talking about some of the best practices that we've seen from some of the digital transformation leaders and talking about the talent lessons that we've seen, right? So very quickly, making sure that it stays business aligned. Cecilia mentioned that it's really important to not think of this as technology. So you keep it business aligned and then also try to make demand management a science. You cannot just do this from one location. So most organizations are using a multi-location strategy. We spoke about learning. So a learning platform that's scaled always on becomes important. Ecosystem, right? So embracing academia, startups, what the government is doing becomes important. You need to look beyond STEM. So most folks have thought about digital as only a science, technology, math issue, but it's not. If you go back to the definition of experiences, you need to embrace the arts, humanities, social sciences to bring in the perspectives that will truly drive experience transformation. We spoke about crowd, right? So how organizations are embracing alternate talent pools. So preparing your policies for that becomes key. Acquisition is not enough. Driving relentless focus on talent retention is something that we're seeing significantly from the best-in-class players. And finally, there's a lot of conversation about millennials, but think about the fact that fresh graduates joining the workforce in 2019 represent the first batch of post-millennials or Gen Z. So preparing for a workforce that's post-millennial is also becoming important for these enterprises. So some pretty insightful, innovative practices that we are seeing from some of our Pinnacle leaders, and that was trait number 5. With that, Cecilia, any summary thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll just do a brief recap of our 5 traits. The first one was really having a clear and business-driven purpose. The second one was around building enterprise-wide commitment to transformation, which then means that you have to move your company into the age of agile. With agile, obviously comes risk, and you engage in some measured risk-taking. And if you're going to accomplish that, you really need the right talent to support that. So with that, we're going to move into questions. So Jamit, I'll turn it back over to you to lead us through the question and answers.
Perfect. Yes, and there's a couple of questions that have come in already, but just a quick recap as to the process of submitting questions. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a panel for questions. You can just type the question and send it to us, and we'll have this ready. I'll just give it about 15 seconds. While we are waiting for the questions to come in, a couple of additional housekeeping points. All attendees will receive the materials that we've presented today. So you'll receive a follow-up email with instructions to accessing today's presentation. And we spoke about those 5 Pinnacle assessment studies. So if there's anyone who wants to engage to have a complimentary assessment of where your organization is on the journey, please reach out to either Cecilia or I, and we can continue that dialogue. So with that, Cecilia, I'm gonna have a couple of questions here. I'm gonna send the first one your way. What are some of the top mistakes that you see companies make in driving digital transformation?
Yeah, that's a great one, Jamit. And I think it goes all the way back to the first slide that you talked through, which is really treating your transformation like a project. There's a long history of how you implement technology that has been a significant part of the success of so many enterprises. successful IT CIOs think about success in certain ways. High performing individuals think about managing their careers in certain ways, which is really all around this idea of I can set a vision, I can build out a detailed plan, I deliver against that plan on time, under budget. And that has been what success has been measured by. Reduction in IT budgets has been what success has been measured by. And when you do those types of things, and sweating your legacy assets is something that has been a success criteria. If you use those criteria in your digital transformation, you're setting yourself up for failure, because there's no way that you can stay aligned with the rapidly evolving expectations of your stakeholders. And we often think about that as from a customer perspective. And while we are thinking about the other stakeholders, the reason it's kind of okay to think about it from a customer-centric perspective is because your employees are actually somebody's customer. And so their daily interactions in their lives are really shaping how they expect to engage with businesses. And that means the businesses where they're a customer and the businesses where they're an employee. So those frameworks and expectations are evolving and changing rapidly. Businesses need to keep up with that. It's not a 3-year cycle any longer. And so you cannot freeze and decide that you come up with a great solution and freeze it forever. Those don't work. And just really thinking about sweating your legacy assets doesn't work either. If it doesn't fit and doesn't deliver, you need to think about ways to transform and to enable your infrastructure and your IT to continuously evolve to stay current and relevant.
Yeah, no, Cecilia, excellent perspectives. One of the biggest failure points that I have seen, just to add to that, is not budgeting enough time and effort for the change management exercise, right?
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah.
One of the mistakes that we've seen is companies completely underestimate the change, in some cases, the shock that digital transformation is going to create in the system, right? And as we've looked at some journeys, there are pretty significant budget dollars being allocated to the change effort upfront. So making sure that you think about that change management effort upfront and fund it appropriately is another important attribute of ensuring success.
So Jamit, I think that's spot on. I mean, because one of the things when we're helping enterprises form their digital transformation strategies and launch their journey management efforts, one of the things that we tell them is it's important to go slow to go fast. And what we mean by that is you have to get the people on board. You have to make sure that you take the time to communicate to everybody, to make sure that they're up to speed. So you might put a strategy together in a couple of months. It is okay to take another month in order to make sure that the organization really understands and really embraces and understands the implication to the people and to their status quo of the types of things that need to change, because your outcomes will be accelerated greatly versus you start down the path immediately and you forget to bring people along, and you get resistance all the way throughout, and you greatly slow down your outcomes. So that's a great point.
Perfect. I think we just have time for one more, and I'm gonna take that myself. Cecilia, feel free to chime in. Questions about how are companies executing digital? Are they relying more on outsourcing or less as it pertains to digital transformation? And unfortunately, I wish there was a simple answer. We don't have enough time to go into it. But in general, if you go back to the last trait that we described, there's a talent crisis in the marketplace today, which is causing more enterprises to look outside their environments and look to drive more speed through the use of partners. There are examples of some very large firms that are trying to do some of this more internally. They are scaling up their own talent factories. But in general, as we see in the near term, more outsourcing happening and more reliance on third-party providers as digital transformation accelerates. Cecilia, I don't know if you had a quick point to add to that.
No, I think that that's spot on. I think that the talent shortage that you mentioned is really causing the need for more, because the IT service providers tend to have the ability to train up that talent. So I think you're spot on.
Excellent. So keeping in mind, the time here, Peter, let me send this back to you.
Excellent. Thank you to both you, Jimit and Cecilia, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. In addition, please be sure to check out Everest Group's blog and other complementary resources to access their current perspectives on digital transformation. Of course, you may also preview relevant published research on the reports portal, which you can access from the upper right-hand corner of their corporate site. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.